Thank you, Brother Williams. As I said last month and just previously, that we have a guest. He's on the telephone line from California, and he is a co-author of a book entitled Why We Will Never Win the War on AIDS. His name is Bryan J. Ellison, and he co-authored this book with Dr. Peter H. Dunsberg. And Dr. Dunsberg is a professor at the University of California at Berkeley. And Dr. Bryan Ellison, Mr. Bryan Ellison, a doctoral student, was one of his high achievers students at the University of California at Berkeley. So we're happy to have Mr. Ellison with us this morning to deal with this very controversial and important subject. Can you hear me, Mr. Ellison?
Yes, I can, and thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Good, good. Would you like to give us a little bit more detail about your background and association with Dr. Dunsberg?
Well, until recently, I've spent several years at the as a doctoral student, as you said, at the UC Berkeley, studying viruses and molecular biology, which is the science of studying DNA and genetics and viruses and cell culture and that sort of thing. So we've been working on studying cancer and AIDS in particular, which is where in studying AIDS we became, Dr. Dunsberg and then I, in joining him, became very controversial, and I ended up losing my PhD even after 5 years, and Dr. Dunsberg ended up losing his government research grant because of the discoveries that we made.
Why do you suppose there's such resentment and opposition to you and Dr. Dunsberg as a result of your studies concerning HIV and AIDS?
Well, the war on AIDS this year, as a result of pressure from President Clinton, is now costing the U.S. taxpayers, just through the federal government alone, some $7 billion. That's a lot of money, and it's a lot of power. That money is being spent through 4 or 5 federal agencies primarily, or maybe 6 federal agencies. And the research money is coming mostly through the National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control and a couple of other agencies. And this money has bought scientists. Scientists do not necessarily search for truth anymore. In fact, mostly scientists will research and come to whatever conclusions they can get grants for and money. And in 1984, it was declared by the federal government at a press conference that AIDS, the AIDS epidemic and the AIDS disease, was caused by a particular virus that we now call HIV. That was announced at a press conference by scientists who then, that afternoon, got the patent on the virus and on the test for the virus, and has become very wealthy since that time selling the test for the virus. But there had been no scientific studies at that point that showed that this virus was the cause of AIDS. And indeed, we're saying that since then, no studies have ever emerged to show that HIV is actually the cause of AIDS. In other words, there's now good reason to believe that we found the wrong cause of AIDS, and that the $7 billion spent this year in the war on AIDS, the $30 billion spent up to this date on the war on AIDS, which is all being spent to study this virus, is barking up the wrong tree. It's actually a wild goose chase designed for political reasons to chase this virus when in fact something else causes AIDS.
Are you and Dr. Dunsberg the only people, noted scientists, people in the medical field, or virologists that hold this position?
No, in fact, that's a wide misperception, is that we're the only ones. There are now over 200 scientists and medical doctors who have broken with the dogma of the scientific establishment and have begun to challenge this idea that HIV causes AIDS over the last several years. The list of scientists now includes top people, Nobel laureates, members of the National Academy of Sciences, and Dr. Duesberg is himself a member of the National Academy, but several other members as well. People who've received the Lasker Prize. Albert Sabin, who was the inventor of the major polio vaccine. A number of the very top scientists and medical doctors in our society today, over 200 of them, have now stepped forward to say that they're no longer convinced that we have the right cause of AIDS. Dr. Duesberg and others now believe that they may be right, that in fact the government has been chasing the wrong cause for over 11 years, and that this is worth a lot of money, and that there's a political agenda at stake. But because these scientists are now speaking out and challenging the official view of AIDS, it's beginning to threaten the financing of the war on AIDS. If this information were to get out, President Clinton's war on AIDS would collapse almost overnight, and we would find out that we have been talking about condoms and birth control and other topics that are inappropriate for school. We've been talking about these topics now to grade school children on the excuse of protecting them from AIDS and from the deadly AIDS virus, when in fact that AIDS virus may not cause AIDS after all.
What research or information led you to this position that you now hold?
We have discovered HIV is a virus that in fact, one would expect not to be the cause of AIDS. It is, in fact, a type of virus that we've been studying since the 1910s. It's called a retrovirus, and it's the sort of virus that has become very familiar to scientists. It's the subject of textbook studies. I've studied retroviruses from animals. And one of the most unique and distinguishing features of retroviruses, as opposed to many other categories of virus, is that they do not cause disease. They don't kill or destroy tissues in the body. They don't kill cells. In fact, I have grown HIV in T cells. T cells are the white blood cells of the immune system that help you fight off infection. According to the official scientific view, if you are infected with HIV, it infects your T cells, destroys them, gets rid of your immune system, and leaves you susceptible to opportunistic infections that finally kill you off, like pneumonia. A lot of money on testing for it, and public health officials find that convenient because if they can declare it, for example, to be a sexually transmitted virus, they can now use that as an excuse to begin talking about very inappropriate subjects to very young children in school, and the AIDS epidemic has been used as that kind of excuse.
Well, let me ask you this. Is it certain that a person who is HIV positive will develop AIDS?
Not at all. This is another very big myth, is that if you get infected with HIV, you are doomed to AIDS within 10 years. The fact is that there are 13 or 14 million people on this planet who were already HIV positive at least 10 years ago when we first had the test available. They may have been HIV positive longer than that. In fact, there's reason to think that these people may have been HIV positive all their lives, many of them, or most of them, and inherited it from their mothers. Of these 13 or 14 million HIV positives who've been HIV positive for at least 10 years, 95% or more have never developed AIDS. Never. That's in at least 10 years. That we're including Africa, Europe, the United States, Thailand. Wherever you go in Africa, there are 6 to 8 million people with HIV, and only a few 100,000 of them, maybe 300,000 or so, have actually developed anything that is called AIDS. And what they get in Africa is very different than what's gotten here in the United States. Over there, it's a different set of diseases. They get very different diseases than homosexuals get in this country. But because they're HIV positive, the diseases they have are being renamed AIDS instead of being referred to as the traditional diseases that they used to be. These are not new diseases. They're just being renamed AIDS. And in the United States, among male homosexuals, we have yet a different set of diseases that are also being called AIDS in people who are HIV positive, and yet most of these HIV positives are not becoming sick.
Let me see if I understand you. You're saying that there are people who are HIV positive in Africa. I think I read a case of some a group of people in Africa who are HIV positive and they had never developed AIDS?
Well, in fact, almost all the Africans with who are HIV positive have never developed AIDS. Part of what has to be remembered here is that we've only had maybe 250, 300,000 Africans developing what's called AIDS, and 6 to 8 million who are HIV positive, and that's in 10 years. So that would be, what would that be? About 1 in every 30 of the 6 to 8 million Africans with HIV. That means that 1 in every 30 is, or in other words, less than 3%, is developing AIDS or has developed AIDS over the last 10 years. So 97% of HIV positives in Africa have never developed AIDS. And we have to remember that being HIV positive does not mean you have HIV, the so-called AIDS virus. HIV positive means that you test positive for antibodies against the virus. Antibodies are made by you, your body, and your immune system to protect you from viruses. Most of us were infected with chickenpox, or maybe even measles, but at least chickenpox when we were younger. Chickenpox is a virus that infects you when you're young. Then your body makes the antibodies against chickenpox, and the virus goes away, usually forever. We have now the antibodies. Those of us who were infected with chickenpox when we were young now have chickenpox antibodies. If you were to test us, you would say we are chickenpox positive because we have the antibodies. But that doesn't mean we have the disease anymore. The virus is gone. It's the same in HIV positive patients. These are patients who no longer have HIV. Their bodies were infected years ago. They overcame it. Now they have only the antibodies left. It's as if they were vaccinated now against it, just as we might be measles positive because we were vaccinated against measles. So you wouldn't expect this virus to cause disease. Once you're antibody positive, you should be fine. But scientists, for billions of dollars, they've been willing to turn upside down all the rules of science and biology to pretend that now if you have antibodies against a virus, that somehow suddenly means that instead of being protected, you're now doomed.
So what you're describing, and I think you used the term in the ad, that this is a great scam, that some people are really dying as a result of false information?
Yes, there are two ways in which this is happening. We believe, of course, that if we've got the wrong cause of AIDS here, HIV, then the real cause of AIDS is not being warned about. And secondly, the treatment itself, and I'll discuss that first before talking about the real cause of AIDS, the treatment itself, we now believe, since 1987, has itself become a cause of AIDS. The treatment is a drug called AZT, or azithromycin. It's a very powerful chemotherapy drug, and I think most people know or have heard of or know of cancer patients who are on chemotherapy. Chemotherapy uses some of the strongest, most toxic chemicals ever known to man. In fact, the very first chemotherapy was mustard gas, the poison used in World War I. And AZT is such a chemotherapy. It's designed to kill growing tissues, such as, for example, cancer. Patients who are on chemotherapy, though, the side effects are just horrible and tremendous, and doctors usually hope that the chemotherapy will kill off the cancer at a faster rate than it kills off the patient. But, of course, it destroys all growing tissues, and parts of your body are made of growing tissues. Your blood supply is constantly formed of new cells that are being turned over and new ones are being created. So if you take chemotherapy, sometimes you need blood transfusions. Your immune system, your T cells are destroyed by chemotherapy. The lining of your stomach and your intestines, your skin tissues, your hair follicles. Cancer chemotherapy patients lose their hair because the chemicals destroy the hair follicles. It destroys all kinds of tissues, and this is why cancer patients on chemotherapy taking these chemical drugs waste away and look very, very horrible. And in fact, it's well known that among cancer patients taking chemotherapy that they have always been getting AIDS-type diseases, like AIDS-type pneumonia, pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, and so forth. because their immune systems are so destroyed that they are now susceptible to infection. AZT is a chemical that was originally designed as chemotherapy for cancer. It was so toxic that it couldn't even be approved for fighting cancer in the 1960s, so it stayed on the shelf. In the 1980s, the drug companies looked at this drug and said, look, we've already spent all the money to develop this drug. Why not just go ahead and get it approved for AIDS treatment? So all the normal requirements were suspended. Pressure from the gay lobby forced the FDA, or in cooperation with the FDA, caused the FDA to bypass the normal testing requirements. Even though AZT showed up as being very toxic, they terminated all the studies early and went ahead and put AZT on something called the fast track for approval, so as to get it approved as the only legitimate therapy for AIDS and even prevention for AIDS in healthy HIV-positive people. Today, healthy people who are only HIV positive and have no reason to think that they, if you look at it, there's no reason to think that they're going to die of AIDS ever in their lives, are being pushed to take AZT now, this very toxic chemotherapy, by doctors. This includes hemophiliacs and homosexuals and heroin addicts and other people who just are HIV positive, maybe got the virus from their mothers. In fact, now there is legislation before Congress, or before various legislatures, that would require all pregnant mothers, 4 million a year, all pregnant mothers would have to be tested for HIV antibodies, and if they're positive, while they're pregnant, they would have to take this very toxic chemical that destroys all growing tissues, including the baby growing in the womb. And they would be forced to do so, all on the basis of this drug that is very toxic, and yet was approved for political reasons under gay lobby pressure.
I've got two questions with reference to what you've just said, but I think it would be beneficial at this point to tell us the account of baby Lindsay, page 197 in your book. Are you familiar with that?
Lindsay Nagel?
Yes.
Right. Lindsay Nagel was a very classic case. Her parents got in contact with us about about 3 years ago, I would say. What had happened was Steve and Cheryl Nagel of Minnesota had adopted a baby who was just a few months old from an orphanage in Romania, and they discovered shortly after bringing her back to the United States that she had been transfused with blood at some point under the Romanian medical system, and it turned out that young Lindsay was HIV positive. She had the antibodies against HIV, so at some point she had been infected with HIV, just probably when she was only days or weeks old as a baby. She was not suffering any symptoms of AIDS, but once the doctors found out that the baby was HIV positive, the first thing that happened at the University of Minnesota Medical Clinic and Children's Hospital is that the doctors began very shortly putting young Lindsay on AZT. The effect was rather dramatic. Young Lindsay began to, she stopped growing at some point because, again, this chemotherapy destroys growing tissues, and a baby is entirely made of growing tissues. Young Lindsay stopped growing. She began developing severe leg cramps. Her diet, her appetite disappeared. She began getting side effects and symptoms that were related to AIDS, and she began suffering. The doctors blamed her symptoms on HIV, not on their treatment, of course. But the parents began to become more and more concerned, and when they finally heard about this controversy with over 200 scientists now questioning whether HIV even causes AIDS, and most of us declaring that AZT is a very toxic and dangerous chemical that should never have been approved, and that is now the standard of treatment for AIDS patients, and we believe is actually causing AIDS in those people. When they found out about that, they decided to take young Lindsay off of AZT secretly without the doctor knowing. As soon as they took young Lindsay off AZT, which she had been on for over a year, she immediately began recovering. Leg cramps went away. She began growing. Her AIDS-like symptoms disappeared overnight. And we have other studies, by the way, on other AIDS patients. When you take them off AZT, they immediately begin recovering from AIDS once they stop taking AZT. And this is now beginning to concern more and more doctors who are even the most establishment medical doctors now who refuse to question HIV as the cause of AIDS are beginning to get very worried about this drug and thinking maybe it shouldn't be pushed so hard, but there's a lot of politics behind it. So the Nagels took young Lindsay off of AZT. She began recovering. The doctor praised Lindsay's progress and said, keep her on that AZT, it's starting to work. And then shortly thereafter found out that Lindsay had been taken off AZT and was quite furious. And in fact, the doctors began threatening Mr. and Mrs. Nagel with even having the child removed from their care and put in a foster home and so forth. And fortunately, the Nagels have fought this off politically and were able to protect their daughter, who just is about 3.5 years old now and is growing and finally doing well and come back on the chart and seems to have recovered, fortunately, without too much permanent damage from the medical treatment. She's HIV positive and doing well.
I would imagine that the legal fallout as a result of this knowledge becoming, say, known to people who have lost relatives and friends as a result of this AZT treatment would be tremendous.
Yes, in fact, Burroughs Wellcome, the international pharmaceutical company that produces AZT, has taken 2 steps to try to protect itself politically and legally from what they see as impending legal action and political action against them. Number one is they have done something called corporate shielding. They've taken the division that produces AZT and incorporated it as a separate corporation so that once it's sued, that the parent company will be protected. Secondly, what they have done is in the last 6 to 7 years, Burroughs Wellcome has dispersed now millions of dollars, and I do mean millions of dollars, to AIDS activist groups, almost entirely to gay rights organizations. The gay rights movement has been built in the last 6 to 7 years largely off of money from pharmaceutical companies like Burroughs Wellcome, and now from 2 or 3 other companies that also produce very similar and very toxic AIDS drugs, very much like AZT, has been sending this money to ACT UP, known as the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, ACT UP, and other gay rights organizations. Some of these organizations you read about in the news that demonstrate and cause riots and attack people are being funded by these pharmaceutical companies, and in some cases receive millions of dollars from these companies, which has in effect ensured the full cooperation of the gay rights movement in cooperating with continuing to keep pressure on the federal government to keep AZT legal and even to promote it and push it as forcible treatment. Even though you might think offhand this is not in the interest of homosexuals, but the point is the gay rights movement is completely bought and paid for by the pharmaceutical industry, and has accomplished 2 things. A, it protects AZT politically and legally, creating a lobby on its behalf, and second, of course, the gay rights movement has become a powerful legislative force in the last few years, precisely because they've made this pact with the AIDS industry.
Mr. Ellison, I'm sure Brother William has some questions in a few minutes, but I'd like to ask you this. What about the behavioral implications that are mentioned? We know that AZT could be one cause of people's immune system being destroyed, but what are the behavioral things that impact a person getting AIDS?
Okay, well, the question, of course, would be what has been causing AIDS since even before AZT was introduced. AZT has probably caused a good percentage of AIDS cases to this day, but originally the AIDS epidemic showed up among homosexual men in 1980 and 81, long before AZT was approved or used for treatment. And the question is, what was happening to them? What most people don't realize is that, and this is a fact that has been kept hidden by the homosexual community in this country and in Europe, because it's a very embarrassing fact. And in these days when gay rights are being pushed as a political agenda, it's not something that gay rights activists want the average member of the public to know. Most people are aware that fast-track male homosexuals these days are very sexually active, that they are in the bathhouses and the sex clubs and discos. What most people don't know, in addition to this promiscuity, is that the promiscuity is so intense, in many cases involving dozens of partners in a single evening and hundreds to thousands of sexual partners with each year, is that this kind of intense sexual activity is accompanied by chemicals to make it possible. Drug abuse is probably more severe among male homosexuals in this country than in any other part of the population. Male homosexuals will go into the bathhouses in the evening. They will take cocaine, amphetamines, methamphetamines, and other drugs to get going and to get stimulated and to make them able to carry out their promiscuity. Then they take drugs like very, very toxic drugs like poppers, which are alkylated nitrites, and they take ethyl chloride that facilitate, that actually make it more possible for them to carry out types of sexual activity that are unique to homosexuals, which are otherwise normally physically not normal and not natural and possible unless you're taking these drugs. And then finally, to wind down, they'll take yet other drugs. Instead of stimulants, they'll take downers and tranquilizers and maybe heroin and various other drugs. So that in the course of an evening, a typical fast-lane male homosexual will have consumed a number of drugs, some of them extremely powerful drugs, some of them very toxic like the poppers, which we believe cause the skin cancer known as Kaposi sarcoma in gay men that is called an AIDS disease, and yet it occurs not among other AIDS patients, but almost entirely only among homosexual men, who are really almost the only people in the population who use the drugs known as poppers, or the drugs, the ethyl chloride drugs. And these drugs make possible the whole lifestyle, but what they don't want to acknowledge, and what most people don't realize, is if you're using those levels of toxic drugs and in those combinations for 7 to 10 years, by the time you've gone that long, those drugs have completely wiped out the immune system. They have destroyed the body. Very few people can use drugs for that long without being completely, their total physical health wiped out after a while. And what we're looking at with the AIDS epidemic, and this was the very first suspicion that crossed the mind of the first scientists who looked at these AIDS cases, was that this was a product of the severe drug use going on in the male homosexual community that is not seen nearly as much anywhere else in the population. Even with the widespread drug abuse today, none of it is as severe as among male homosexuals in particular, more than even female homosexuals because of the promiscuity and so forth. And that was, in fact, the very first thing that was suspected as the cause of AIDS before a political decision was made that this epidemic should be blamed on a virus and should believed to be infectious, that we can all catch it. That's the propaganda from the federal government and from the gay rights lobby, is that AIDS is a disease that anybody can catch. You could be middle class, heterosexual, with a family in the suburbs, going about your business in a normal way. You can be a Bible-believing person going to church. You too can get AIDS. That has been the propaganda now for 10 years because they want to believe it's a virus. And when we talk, one of the sources of opposition we get as scientists trying to point out what we believe to be the cause of AIDS here, based on some very powerful evidence that has been uncovered in the last several years, which we summarize in our book, that every time we talk about it, one of the leading sources of opposition, other than the federal AIDS establishment, is the gay rights lobby, which receives, as I've said, a lot of money from the pharmaceutical industry now with regard to AIDS, and a lot of money from the Centers for Disease Control and from the federal government, and who get very angry at us. And this really surprised us at first until we thought about it, who get very angry with us for blaming the victim and for letting heterosexual people, ordinary middle-class folk, off the hook to where they don't feel, where we're, in effect, we're letting people know they don't catch AIDS unless they're doing long-term heavy drug use.
That last statement that you made, how do people get AIDS? Are there 2 or 3 ways that a person can develop full-grown AIDS? And the follow-up question, can a person who has developed AIDS be healed?
Well, Okay, both are excellent questions. So we don't believe you can catch AIDS. It's not caused by any virus at all. That, in other words, the virus is the HIV is the fourth virus blamed for AIDS. In fact, before then, the virus hunters, who are the most powerful men in the biomedical research establishment, were trying to blame other viruses for AIDS. First, they chose cytomegalovirus, which causes a disease that's not unlike mononucleosis, but they also wanted this virus to cause AIDS. Then they switched to Epstein-Barr virus, which does cause the classical mononucleosis that we know about, and that one also they wanted to blame for AIDS. Then they went to HTLV-1, which was a retrovirus and also harmless, but they wanted to blame it for leukemia and then also for AIDS. And finally, they settled on HIV as the virus they're blaming for AIDS. There's no reason to think any of those cause AIDS. In fact, that there's no virus at all that causes AIDS. AIDS is today 90% of AIDS cases in the United States and Europe, unlike in Africa. 90%, 9 out of every 10 AIDS cases, are still men. They're still men. This is unbelievable. This is not something you see in a venereal disease or a sexually transmitted disease or in the flu or any other disease that you can catch. All other transmitted diseases, sexually transmitted or flus or colds or anything else, are 50% men, 50% women within a very short period of time. Even the sexually transmitted diseases, including the venereal diseases and hepatitis B, which is bloodborne like HIV, they started out in the gay community, the homosexual community in the 1970s after the homosexuals came out of the closet after gay liberation and began to become sexually very active and promiscuous. They were the first to see these new diseases rise, but very quickly these diseases spread outward. They began to infect healthcare workers treating these homosexuals in hospitals. They began to go through prostitutes. They began to spread into the sexually active heterosexual population. That part of the population that's sexually active began to catch the disease. And within a couple of years, every one of those diseases became equal between men and women. And yet AIDS, after 15 years, is still 9 out of every 10 AIDS cases occurring in men. That is a dead giveaway that this is not caused by a virus, and it's not transmissible. It's something in the lifestyles of the people who are developing AIDS. If you look at those lifestyles, again, over 90%, maybe 94% of people who are developing AIDS in the United States or Europe are either homosexual men using large numbers of drugs for 10 years. I mean lots and lots of drugs. Or they are heroin addicts, who are the second most severe group of drug addicts, who are injecting drugs, cocaine or heroin, through needles right into their bloodstream. And again, that's the hardest core point of drug use. That's the end point after a person has tried all kinds of other drugs. That's the point at which they're ready to die, and that covers 94% of all AIDS cases in the United States and Europe. And then there are a few others of people who simply happen to have a tuberculosis or a pneumonia that gets renamed AIDS because the person also, by coincidence, happens to be HIV positive. And now in the last 7 to 8 years, we've been adding a number of AIDS cases through the AZT treatment. So we believe it's almost entirely drugs for almost everybody in the Western world. This is a classic case. Greg Louganis, who was recently referred to as having AIDS. Greg Louganis was, in fact, a very active homosexual and probably used quite a few drugs himself.
Well, we're going to go to our telephone line, and if you'd like to call in and ask Mr. Bryan Ellison some questions, feel free to do so. Brother Williams, do you have any questions at this time?
I just had one question in particular, and that is you kept referring to HIV and that it's not caused or related to AIDS per se. How does one get HIV? What is that? What causes it?
That's a very interesting question. HIV is a virus that can spread like viruses do, and if HIV caused AIDS, then you would see AIDS spreading out of the risk groups the way the virus can spread out of the risk groups. HIV, as I said earlier in the show, is has infected about 13 or 14 million people worldwide. And the interesting thing, one of the things we have learned about retroviruses like HIV in animals and in humans over the last 80 years or 85 years that we've studied these viruses is that in general, in nature, these things are transmitted mother to child during pregnancy, so that when the child is born, it's already infected with the retrovirus. This is possible because these viruses are so harmless, particularly these retroviruses, are so harmless that it never causes a disease. So you could be born with it, you'll never suffer disease, and you'll grow up to have your own children who will catch the virus, and it goes on and on like that. It is otherwise, unless you get it at birth, it's very difficult to transmit. So we believe that the great majority of people in the world, and probably just about everyone in Africa who has the virus, these people inherited it from their mothers, who in turn inherited it from their mothers. And we have good reason to believe that this virus is many centuries old in Africa and has never caused a problem there. And it's still not causing an AIDS epidemic there. We have some diseases associated with malnutrition and starvation over there that are being renamed AIDS, but they're different diseases than the homosexuals get in our country. And in fact, these are diseases that have been known with or without HIV in Africa for a long time. And many AIDS patients in Africa, if you simply feed them, some of them just do not get even adequate food. They're dislocated from civil war and strife and lack of food and access to food and other things. If you just feed them, many of them recover from what is called AIDS. But HIV there is probably transmitted mother to child during pregnancy. It probably happens quite a bit in this country too. There are about 1 million people in this country who are HIV positive. Most of those probably got it from their mothers during pregnancy. Now, if you are very sexually active, like a male homosexual in this country, then you finally begin to get a serious chance of picking up HIV too, because if you're having 1,000 partners a year or more, well, now the risk begins to go up, and so the homosexuals who are extremely promiscuous are the major group in this country that are beginning to spread HIV amongst each other sexually, but that's a very difficult thing to do. So the fact that HIV is very common among homosexuals is just a testament to the fact that they are so sexually active that even they can start spreading the virus. But the virus is well outside the risk groups. The virus is 50% of people in this country infected with HIV apparently are men, and 50% are women. That's apparently been true since at least going back as far as 1985, based on all the testing that we've done. And yet 9 out of every 10 AIDS cases are consistently men. Okay. And a virus doesn't in a risk group like men, but this disease, AIDS, certainly is.
Okay, we've got a caller. But what you're saying is HIV is transmissible, but AIDS is not. And then we're going to the telephone. We've got a caller that wants to ask you a question. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's exactly right. Absolutely.
Okay. Caller, do you have a question or a comment?
Yes, I do.
Just a second. Can you hear the caller?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good.
Okay. Am I speaking to Bryan J. Ellison?
Yes, you are.
I'm calling about why there seems to be a cover-up here, and who is behind the cover-up. If there is actually no such thing as this disease called AIDS, there's only this retrovirus HIV. Why is this not being brought forward to the American public?
That's a very excellent question. It's a question we cover in at least 2 or 3 of the chapters in our book because it's so very, very important. As I mentioned earlier, there have been some $30 billion, that's $30